you. Welcome to the debate today. We're chatting about, well, what some experts are calling the biggest spiritual shock of the century, the potential public acknowledgement of non-human intelligence.
Yeah, it's a huge hypothetical.
I mean, just think about it for a second. We're talking about a scenario that, honestly, it sounds like pure sci-fi, right? But it carries this really profound theological weight. What actually happens when, say, official state authorities release undeniable, like highly credible evidence of unidentified aerospace phenomena, UAP? I've seen it described pretty dramatically as a potential cosmic 9/11 for global belief systems, because it forces this immediate Kuhnian paradigm shift, moving us basically overnight from believing we're in a silent cosmos to suddenly having to deal with an involved cosmos.
That shift is, it's absolutely monumental. It introduces this powerful third player, right? The anomaly or whatever you want to call it. And it fundamentally challenges, both science and religion at the same time. Suddenly, humanity might not be the apex species. And that just shakes the foundation of our entire self-identity.
Exactly. And that leads directly to our central question for today. When faced with this kind of proven, high-level, non-human agency, are established religious institutions obligated? Is there a moral or intellectual duty to fundamentally revise their core sacred doctrines? Things like the uniqueness of humanity or the scope of salvation. My position is yes, they are absolutely obligated to revise and integrate this new reality, partly for intellectual integrity, but honestly, more importantly, to perform their pastoral duties effectively.
I disagree with that word obligated. I think revision is frankly an overreaction, and it dangerously risks compromising what is held to be divine, eternal revelation itself. I actually hold that our existing pretty robust interpretive frameworks are sufficient. They're sufficient to categorize this new phenomenon without needing to, tear up the sacred texts or redefine timeless truths.
Okay, but the reason I push for obligation really rests on credibility. I mean, if you look back at history, specifically the Galileo affair, that's like the perfect diagnostic map for institutional failure, right? When the church prioritized a rigid, literal reading of scripture over observable, proven facts, that the earth revolves around the sun, it suffered just massive long-term credibility loss. Now, the adaptation eventually happened, sure, but the damage was done to its intellectual authority. If the state presents hard UAP data, religious bodies just cannot afford to retreat into defensive denial again. That would be repeating history, wouldn't it?
But I think you might be misreading the Galileo conflict just slightly there. It wasn't just about the data itself. It was really about epistemic authority. Who gets to say what's true?
Right, exactly. It was about hermeneutical authority, the right to interpret the facts. And that's precisely what we face now. The state maybe will present the data, the raw facts, but religious institutions, they have to provide the meaning. That's their role. And if they fail to adapt, they fail in their core pastoral duty. They leave the public vulnerable to total spiritual anxiety or, honestly, much worse, vulnerable to radical new religious movements that will inevitably pop up claiming the UAP are the actual source of revelation, replacing the old gods.
Okay, I agree that the risk of that kind of chaos is incredibly high. I definitely see that. But that still doesn't mean we have to tear up the rule book. Revision, as you're framing it, puts secular material facts which, let's be honest, might be presented by a government with its own political agendas. It puts those above divine, eternal revelation. Core doctrines, think about the singularity of Christ's incarnation in Christianity or the finality of the prophet in Islam. These are based on divine truth claims, not on observable facts that could easily be manipulated or misinterpreted for, say, geopolitical gain.
But if the facts become universally undeniable, accepted by everyone, how do you sustain the unique claim of humanity without just alienating everyone who accepts the basic facts on the table?
Because the UAP phenomenon itself, if we accept some of the more, let's say, conservative orthodox interpretations, challenges not just science, but spiritual order itself. I mean, think about figures like Father Seraphim Rose. He saw the entire UFO phenomenon as purely
demonic, as in delusions placed by the devil specifically to draw humans away from true revelation. So if UAP are actually a sophisticated psychological or even spiritual manipulation, then revising doctrine to accommodate them is, well, it's falling straight into Satan's trap, isn't it? We already have robust theological frameworks for non-human intelligence, angels, demons, the jinn in Islam, the Devas and Dharmic faiths. For me, this looks like a crisis of categorization. It's about finding the right existing bucket to put them in, not a crisis demanding we rebuild the buckets themselves.
I appreciate the categorization argument, I do. But I think that completely falls apart when you look at the actual structural stress points within monotheisms, especially around the core doctrine of incarnation. Let's maybe talk about that stress test for a minute.
Well, I think the challenge for the Abrahamic faiths isn't quite uniform here. The Islamic framework, for instance, it actually seems structurally more prepared to handle this without needing major revision. God is referred to as Rabb al-Alamin, Lord of the worlds, plural. That's built in. And Islam already has the category of the jinn, intelligent, free-willed creatures created from smokeless fire. So the core structure doesn't really need altering. It just needs to figure out, okay, are these UAP entities mukallaf? Are they morally responsible agents? Did they receive their own separate revelation? The concept of God himself remains completely unshaken.
Okay, that's a powerful point about Islam's sort of built-in pluralism, I'll grant you that. But I would frame it differently. While Islam might have the jinn category ready to go, Christianity hits a unique theological wall almost immediately. It's the classic, did Jesus die for Klingons 2 problem.
Oh, right, the old sci-fi thought experiment, yeah.
But it's the central stress point for Christians. That doctrine posits a unique one-time cosmic event, the Incarnation, specifically designed for the redemption of humanity on Earth. So if you accept the existence of ETI, you seem to be left with 3 pretty bad options. Either they are also fallen, but God just ignored them, or they don't need saving at all. Or, and this is the tricky one, Christ has to have had multiple separate incarnations across the cosmos.
But hold on a sec. Couldn't you simply argue for something like universal cosmic salvation? That Christ's sacrifice, although it was physically located here on Earth, had a sort of cosmic, energetic effect that redeems all life, regardless of where it is in the universe. That doesn't really require revision, does it? It just requires a broader interpretation of an event we already acknowledge.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because trying to shoehorn ETI into that singular concept, it seems to require a pretty radical theological move, just to make it make sense. I mean, the leap theologians who are actually tackling this right now, they're proposing things like deep incarnation, which kind of shifts the focus. Traditionally, Christ incarnated as anthropos, as humanity. Deep incarnation argues the logos, the word, actually incarnated into sarx, which means flesh, or even cosmic matter itself. And since that cosmic dust, that sarx, is shared everywhere, the one-time events on Earth can be seen as redeeming all flesh, everywhere.
But wait, that is a major revision. You're fundamentally redefining the subject of the saving act, moving it from humanity specifically to all cosmic matter. That's a huge overhaul of Christology and soteriology, redefining the nature of Christ and the scope of salvation. And it seems driven entirely by the need to stay relevant in a newly populated cosmos. I think the institution could just as easily choose the exclusivism option. Salvation is just for us humans, and other beings, well, they have their own separate plan with God, or no plan.
Right. But that choice, I think, fails the pastoral test. And that's where the real damage happens. This brings us back to that danger of the hermeneutic gold rush. I'm just not convinced that sticking these beings in the jinn bucket or the demon bucket is sufficient or frankly pastorally responsible when people are genuinely terrified or confused.
Why would it be insufficient, though? People are familiar with concepts like spiritual warfare, non-human agents.
Because official disclosure isn't just some footnote in a theological journal. It would be experienced as a modern hierophany, a breakthrough of the sacred, or at least the profoundly mysterious into the everyday profane world. It fulfills this deep, primal human longing for the numinous, for contact. And if mainstream churches just retreat and only offer the same old answers, the public is going to rush, absolutely rush towards new religious movements. Think about groups like Realism or Heaven's Gate. They don't just adapt, they aim to replace traditional religion entirely, claiming the aliens are the actual source of revelation, the technological angels of our time. Mainstream institutions must, I think, proactively integrate and maybe even expand their doctrine to fill that dangerous hermeneutic void before it just swallows their congregations whole.
That's a compelling argument about the NRM risk, I admit. But you have to acknowledge the need for epistemic caution here. You seem to be advocating revising eternal truth based potentially on data presented by a secular state, a state that definitely has its own political objectives. What if the disclosure package, for instance, is deliberately timed to coincide with a massive military funding request, or a new push for global surveillance legislation? Is that really a theological document we should be reacting to, or is it a geopolitical one?
Okay, but what if the underlying evidence, the video, the materials, the physical proof, what if that is universally agreed upon by every major scientific authority worldwide?
Even then, we still have to ask, who is packaging the narrative around that evidence, and what is their immediate agenda? Figures like Seraphim Rose and other conservative thinkers, they provide a necessary caution here. If the phenomenon is actually a form of sophisticated psychological manipulation, as even some UFO theorists like Jacques Vallée have suggested, or if it is purely demonic delusion, then the logic, the actual obligation, might be to refuse to change doctrine precisely so we don't validate what could be Satan's most sophisticated trick yet. The first duty has to be fidelity to revelation, not compliance with potentially manipulated geopolitical data releases.
I get the caution, I really do. But let's look at maybe the ultimate test case, where fidelity and fact seem to align much more easily. Consider the Dharmic faiths, Hinduism and Buddhism. They seem to have incredibly low doctrinal vulnerability to this whole scenario. Why don't they face the same kind of crisis? Well, because their cosmologies already feature infinite worlds or loka and multitudes of intelligent non-human beings, deva, asura, you name it. They don't have to revise core concepts like samsara or dharma. They just have to figure out the UAP's current karma.
That's true. For them, it's mainly categorization.
Exactly. And this inherent pluralism, this adaptability, that seems like the model. If monotheisms want to survive this kind of shift without completely fracturing, they might have to adopt a similarly pluralistic, maybe less anthropocentric view, which, to my mind, necessitates revision, particularly of the idea of human uniqueness.
I see why you'd think that. You're essentially arguing that the successful structure of these pluralistic religions proves that fundamental revision is necessary for the others, the monotheisms, to sort of catch up, cosmologically speaking.
Yeah, essentially. The monotheistic model might need to become more like the pluralistic model, at least in its cosmology, to handle this.
And I would maintain that the very fact that Dharmic faiths likely only require categorization actually proves my original point. Radical revision of core doctrine, like upending the Incarnation or the finality of prophecy, is only necessary if you assume your core doctrine is inherently rigid and brittle. But if monotheisms leverage the interpretive flexibility that's already present in their traditions, and trust me, there is a lot of it if you look, then we can achieve that necessary adaptation without sacrificing core tenets.
Like what, specifically? How do you adapt without revision?
We can use retrodition, which basically means finding or reviving older interpretations to fit new facts. For example, revisiting historical debates within Islam about the superiority of humans versus angels, like Al-Razi's arguments, or rereading Ezekiel's visions in the Hebrew Bible, which describe these massive, rotating, complex chariots, maybe reading them as historical accounts of encounters with non-human technology, or taking seriously the descriptions of flying craft, the Vimana in ancient Vedic texts. We can recontextualize what was previously dismissed as myth or pure allegory, and suddenly maybe it fits the new data. That's adaptation through sophisticated interpretation, not the kind of radical, almost panicked revision of divine law that you seem to be proposing.
But isn't deep incarnation essentially the Christian analog to that? It is recontextualizing the existing doctrine of incarnation in a cosmic way. It feels like an evolutionary theological step, not a retreat or a wholesale replacement. If you don't make that step or some equivalent one, Don't you risk repeating the mistakes of the Galileo affair, where the institution was eventually forced to accept the scientific fact anyway, but only after decades of damage to its own intellectual credibility, leaving the public feeling kind of betrayed?
And I'd counter that forcing acceptance prematurely, based on potentially politically motivated data releases, is actually a failure of epistemic justice. It risks sacrificing the authority of the sacred for the expediency of the secular. I think the most responsible theological response is probably to hold firm, categorize the anomaly meticulously within existing robust frameworks, demonology, jinn, maybe something else, whatever fits best, and focus on the perennial internal issues of human significance and salvation, which arguably remain true regardless of who or what is flying overhead.
Okay, so it seems we agree that the struggle is fundamentally hermeneutic. It's all about how we interpret revelation in light of new information. But we just diverge completely on the normative imperative. Should institutions revise doctrine, or should they hold the line?
For me, the state's potential revelation of UAP creates nothing short of an existential crisis of credibility for established faith traditions. Institutions that fail to meet this new reality by expanding their understanding of creation and salvation, they risk becoming fundamentally irrelevant. They risk losing their flock to cults or just apathy and repeating those historical mistakes like with Galileo. Proactive, thoughtful integration of a more cosmic-centric theology feels necessary for both pastoral integrity and just basic institutional survival.
And I maintain that the real existential threat isn't the UAP data itself, but the agenda possibly lurking behind the data, and perhaps an internal willingness within religion to sacrifice sacred truth for material compliance or relevance. We have existing tools, jinn, diva, demonology, angelology, to categorize this new agency without sacrificing the unique status of humanity's covenant with God or the core revelations. The debate is ultimately about the meaning of the universe, and we cannot let secular facts, however compelling, automatically redefine sacred eternal truth.
Well, it seems clear that this struggle between empirical fact or apparent fact and eternal doctrine will absolutely define global spiritual life in the decades after any kind of disclosure. The choice for religious institutions will be, as we've discussed, adaptation or defense.
Indeed, a profound choice.
Wrapping up today's The Debate, hope you got some new insights. See you soon. Keep curious.